all, I want to thank the Ethnobiology Society and all the folks who have already provided a tremendous welcome here for me, and especially, and including last night, where I was self-initiated by a glass of what turned out to be fairly cheap wine.
Award-winning, mind you.
It was
still award-winning, though.
Award-winning cheap wine.
SCPFP funding is limited.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, I'm very grateful for that, and for Michael Thomas, whose brilliance is manifest in having decided to invite me. This is. I took some time trying to come up with this title because a lot of what I do is not in the field, it's behind the scenes. And I was trying to come up with something that would sort of encapsulate the kind of disparate projects that I have been involved in. And basically, that's what I'm going to do, roar through those and give you a sense of how a lot of the background information that you can find in collections, that you can find in libraries and archives and so forth, help inform what we know about ethnology, ethnobiology, and the like. And of course, I had to figure out a way to come up with a title that did not have the obligatory colon in it, because something like 80% of all talks now have colons, and apparently I didn't. There's a reason for this, I think, and it might actually have something to do with what we're going to talk about, and that is the two parts of this. One kind of creates a context, and then the other helps describe that context. And in a lot of ways, that's what we're doing in ethnobiology, and it's also how collections and archives and libraries help support that. So first of all, see if that works, the traditional view of dealing with cultural information and acquiring it is the going into the field and being with and sometimes living with indigenous cultures. There's a certain adventure associated with this. It evokes a sort of a passionate, sometimes even romantic response. I don't do this. But what I have done is work with people who are actually what I think of as being the bright lights of the 20th and the early 21st century. I'm going to run through a couple of them real quick. Some of them you may know, some of them have been out here. Michael Balick at the Institute of Economic Botany, and I have worked on projects involving the National Cancer Institute and building collections databases to help support anti-AIDS studies at the National Cancer Institute. Paul Allen Cox and Sandra Bannock work on Homolanthus nutans. We were building distributional information and key character information for that species and another related species that we were able to provide them. Good friend, Bob Bai from the Institute of Biology in Mexico. He and I worked on a couple of different projects, one involving Edward Palmer, which we'll get to a little bit later, and just a prolific individual working with the Tara Amara in northern Mexico, a silver-tongued devil, and somebody who just wears me out whenever I'm with him. Jonathan Ament, who's working also in Mexico with on the Nahuatl language and the way in which plants are both used, named, and referred to in the Nahuatl language. This is a very interesting book, by the way, if you get a chance. Aaron Crowell, who's one of our peeps at the Smithsonian, but he lives up in Anchorage because we have an Arctic Studies Center up there. And again, one of the projects that I'll speak on in greater detail involves Aaron. Dolores Paperno, she's an archaeobiologist looking at the dietary history of ancient cultures through the use of studying phytoliths. And again, we've been using collections data to build current distributions for a lot of these higher level taxa that she can use then to compare to the data that she's extracting from phytolithic information. And Wade Davis, who is a student of Richard Evans Schultes, and one of many over the years, wrote a book called One River that I helped him with. This is maybe the one book that I would always recommend to people who are interested in this kind of story. And then, of course, Richard Evans Schultes, I had the opportunity to meet him twice. I never had a chance to work with him. He has the distinction of having a book, Plant of the Gods, that has been in constant production since the late 70s. Very much like Mark Merlin's book on coastal plants of Hawaii, only he doesn't have to give them away. Now, let's go back to, should I just hold up a sign that says, okay. Yeah, if I give you long enough. So going back to this idea of the way of acquiring information by going into the field, the way that we do it is different. And if you recognize this picture in the middle, then you're paying attention to the posters on the 4th floor upstairs, because coincidentally, in cruising the internet looking for good pictures, some of which I had, some of which I didn't, I found this one. This is the rock herbarium upstairs, and an unknown student, unknown to me, working there. But this represents the kind of data that is present in herbarium specimens. The United States National Herbarium has 5 million. Universities, botanical gardens, and research institutes around the country probably count for another 100 million. And if you think of all of the herbaria around the world, and we're going to talk about plants pretty much today and nothing else, we're probably looking at 250 million records of specimens that document this thing in this place at this time, what I call the 3 dimensions of biodiversity. 1 is a point, 2 is a distribution, 5 million starts to give you a really rich picture of the biodiversity on Earth over time and distance, and 250 million would just be mind-blowing. We're not there yet. And then the other is a place that I love to go, archives and libraries and digging back to the stacks, and these kinds of pictures remind you of the last scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where they're pushing that little thing down that long hall, and they're going to put it away, and it's never going to see the light of day again. Well, it's a little bit different in this respect. I mean, these are very well organized, very highly indexed, and accessible, but there's data buried here that has never been published. And there's data buried here that is related to data in other boxes. And this whole idea of connecting content is one of the things that we're working very, very much on to try to figure out clever ways to bring related content together that actually comes from different sources. And then these are the field books. I'll talk about the field book project in a little bit. That's one of my pet projects now. There is not just cool data in field books, but there are cool stories in field books. And it's a very personal kind of product, and I think it touches on more than just the kind of thing that we want to get out of it. It touches on the history of collecting, the history of science, and the people that were involved in that. About 15 years ago, I started a project where I got extremely interested in the United States Exploring Expedition because we have at the Smithsonian the original set of specimens, not just plants, but animals and anthropological artifacts. Because it was the federal government's sponsored 4-year around-the-world voyage. Can I help you? Hi. By the way, I want to thank Sean and Melissa from the Ethnobiology Society because they have been the angels that have helped me through getting all of this organized and getting here. And so I told her if she came in late, I'd tease her. So.
Good. True to your word.
This was the American equivalent of the Captain Cook voyage of 60 years earlier. James Cook went out on 3 different expeditions, voyages, and in the 4-year circumnavigation of the globe 60 years later, the U.S. exploring expedition collected more plants, more natural history objects, more anthropological objects, visited more ports of call, mapped more islands, maps that were still being used in World War II, than all three Cook voyages combined. And they discovered Antarctica. And then mapped 1,500 miles of the coast accurately. And I guarantee you there isn't a school child in this country who knows Charles Wilkes. But you all know James Cook, right? That's my mission. I'm going to fix that before I die. Anyway, so here's the deal. I ended up going to 16 different historical societies, herbaria, botanical gardens, to get the kind of data that would start to tell a more comprehensive story of the botanical collecting of this 4-year voyage. And I'm still not done. And it dawned on me that this is not the way things should be. If you're looking for data, you should be able to bring it together without spending the time and money that we did to go out and get it and bring it together. If you're interested in a particular expedition, a particular individual, a particular taxon, you should be able to get related information more easily. By the way, just another quick story. The outflow of the Columbia River is, they visited the Pacific Northwest. The outflow of the Columbia River is so great that even when George Vancouver sailed past there years earlier, he didn't even realize there was a river there because of the mist that it threw up. Well, when Wilkes made an effort to enter at that point, one of the ships were lost, and we realized what a not so safe place that was. At the time, the U.S. and British interests in the area were negotiating where to draw the line, and the Columbia River was one of the options on the table. When he got back from this expedition, he argued vehemently in Congress for the parallel that would put what is now the state of Washington in the United States, because when they went up through the Strait of Juan de Fuca and into Puget Sound, they found safe harbor. And that is what they did, and of course, the rest is history. Washington State is Washington State. So in part, I kind of give him a little credit for having some influence in that regard. There is, in the Smithsonian libraries, they have scanned the 5 narrative volumes that were produced as a result of the expedition. And in here is a lot of really interesting data. This is published data. This is published information that was built when 6 weeks out of the end of the journey, he ordered everybody who was keeping a log, everybody who was keeping a journal, everybody who was keeping a diary to give them to him, federal property. And he pulled it all together, and then without attribution, over a number of years, wrote the 5 volumes from all of the work that everybody else had done. And that includes a lot of interesting intersections of plants and people, specimens that were cultivated, the collecting that was done in different places. And you can go in here and volume by volume, look page by page and read through that. However, this is not scanned, it's not word searchable, and just trying to find the page on which is information that you might be interested in is very hard. So I had a student go through all 5 volumes and put together a database of the location page, the scientific name if we could calculate that, the English common name if we knew it. The keyword over here in column C is the specific reference. That is what the entry said. We've got location, we've got habitat data, and we've got an actual quote. And there are, from the 5 volumes, thousands of entries that now we can go through and look for information as it relates to what they were able to tell about the different areas that they visited and the way in which plants were used or grown. All of what I was just talking about finally led me to realize that we need to have some central repository for information about field books and information about any kind of content that documents the events that take place in the field that result in biological information, specimens, and also the additional data that derives from that. People who are out in the field collecting plants don't just make a list of all the plants they collect. They journal, they diary, they make comments and observations. There's meteorological information in there. There's information about their encounters with local individuals. And that may not be the reason they went out, but there is some really good data in there that needs to be extracted for other reasons. And just knowing where all of these field books are is the goal. So we put this together. The idea was to make this an international field book registry, which is still on the table. But initially, we have cataloged over 8,000 field books within the Smithsonian. We have now begun to page-level scan them and put them up on the Smithsonian's transcription site, and individuals around the world are volunteering and going through and transcribing these so that now they will be word searchable. We're getting just a little bit closer. We have a whole lot longer to go. Put together a really, really rock star team of individuals to work on this project. One of them is the, let me go forward here one, shoot, that didn't work like I thought. Okay, that's right, this is a little bit later. One of them came to me one day and said, Rusty, I'd like you to guest blog for the Fieldbook Project blog. And I said, we have a Fieldbook Project blog? My idea of this was a fairly simple, let's get it all together, let's put it in a database, let's share it. These are not your grandparents' librarians anymore. The social aspect to this, and we'll see this in a little while, the social aspect of this is really important in terms of sharing this kind of information. Because this is, as I said before, this is personal. People gravitate to this kind of information because of the personal stories involved, and it's through the blog that the different interns, and in this case Kira, who's one of our digital imagers, are creating or are encapsulating those stories and putting them up. And so we have the Fieldbook Project Manager on the right, Carolyn Sheffield, who now is with Biodiversity Heritage Library, and Megan Farrader, and Effie Capsalis. They're now the sort of movers and shakers for the Fieldbook Project. The kind of content is more than just the notes from field books. It includes photographs, it includes sketches, and down there is the same little picture of some of the not so well maintained field books. We also got a big grant to go in and start conserving them. Because some of them we couldn't even digitize, we couldn't even handle without some form of remedial conservation. Now this led to another project, the one that I mentioned with Bob By. Edward Palmer was a late 19th century plant collector who was actually, he called himself doctor, partly because he was a medic in the army before that. So Dr. Edward Palmer did some interesting things. He spent a lot of time in the southwestern U.S. and Mexico studying the way various groups used plants. He sort of self-trained himself as an ethnobotanist, but he did an interesting thing that had not been done up to that point. In addition to all the copious notes that he took and the drawings and the descriptions of how things were prepared, he went to a lot of markets and bought material directly from the markets, and that kind of materia medica is still in the Department of Anthropology. But then he also prepared traditional herbarium specimens. So if he collected a gathering net, he also made specimens of the plants that produced the gathering net. If he collected tattoo needles that were the thorns of Chrysopas, he collected the plant that produced those needles. And so here we have this tremendous connection between artifacts that traditionally anthropologists, ethnobotanists would collect, and the kinds of herbarium specimens that botanists would traditionally collect. And he sent them all back to Washington, and they get to the Smithsonian, and all of this stuff went this way to anthro, and all of this stuff went this way to botany, and for over 100 years they never saw each other. Until we put together an exhibit, Bill Merrill and I, that drew together, after over a century, the specimens and artifacts of Edward Palmer's collections. That's him in the Army. We also have an extension of that now, which is a site that brings together all of this content. So you can go in and you can look for different cultures, you can look for different artifacts. It will connect you to the specimens or vice versa. And the other thing that we did was look at traditional cultural boundaries and overlaid that with the location of specimens that were collected or the location of the material that was collected. This is the kind of thing that when we talk about connecting content we mean, but this is a fairly static view of that. It doesn't change. We can add data to it, but it's still just the story of Edward Palmer. Another interest of mine has long been the history of collecting in Alaska. And a couple of years ago, I did present at BSA on this, the long history of collecting in Alaska. And one of the interesting things about that is, and you can appreciate this, when people are in the field, you're more likely to collect a plant than a mouse or a rock. And people do that. In fact, even if they are paleontologists or if they're mammalogists, they're more likely to collect plants than botanists are to collect mice. And so the product of people going into the field, whether they're scientists or not, is the production of material that ends up in herbaria. And in my study of collections that resulted from Alaska over a 200-year period, more than 50% of the people who were collecting and sending specimens to Washington were not scientists. Martin Gorman was one of those. He would be called a naturalist, or in today's parlance, a citizen scientist. He was a sort of glorified accountant, a bookkeeper, who ended up in Portland, got together, hooked up with a few people who formed a little adventure society or climbing group, and made 3 different trips to southern Alaska and did a lot of collecting of plants. So a student and I went through the entire herbarium looking for and extracting all of Martin Gorman's specimens, and that was a tedious cherry-picking op. But one of the reasons for this is that there is information associated with his plant collections which are not on the label. I'll show you what the label looks like. This is your typical what, when, and where. Populus balsamifera. It has a little dimension information along the river bottoms on the Iliamna River in 1902, and that's it. I was able to obtain from the University of Oregon archives his unpublished report of his 1902 trip, in which he says the chief uses of this tree here are for fuel, building cabins, igloos, caches, sweat houses of natives at the Kijit village. A saw pit was found where it was whip-sawed into the coarse lumber. For the doors and flooring of their houses and cabins, 2 boats of this lumber were also seen. That's a lot of good information, and you didn't get that off the specimen. But now you have this information, you can revisit the specimen because nothing replaces the physical thing. But without the knowledge of this information at the archives, we wouldn't be able to tell that story. This is another label of his, and now we're looking at language information, which he had a tendency to collect. If he had access to Kanai common names or Aleut common names or even Russian common names in Alaska, this was post-purchase of Alaska, but there was still a huge Russian population there. He included those. In this case on the label, in other cases not, and yet his original field books, back up a second. So on this specimen, he actually says the roots are boiled and sugar added to the decoction, which is then allowed to stand until fermentation takes place, where it is used in place of whiskey and Kuchi Nu, which I'm sure is just as good as that wine last night. It's also been renamed. So we have this issue of connecting data and then finding out it's connected to a taxon that is not correctly assigned to that particular specimen. We had 2 specimens, and now here's a specimen, the same number 264, and this one says something different. The roots of this fern are boiled or cooked on hot stones and eaten both in the spring and the autumn. Well, that's good information too. But now we've got two different specimens that say, give you different amounts of information about this. In his field book, and these are my little scratches on there as we were working through it, the first entry here is the second entry that we just saw regarding spring and autumn. The middle describes the first quote that was attached to the label. And then finally, there's another line down here which offers just a little bit more information. So you can see that you don't always get the entire story in one place. And in the case of this information, the information on the label, none of that was published, none of that was digitized, none of that was available. And when that happens, and when you start making these connections, you can tell stories. And this is just another example of a Gordon specimen with a Kenai name and with no ethnobotanical information. And then here, the leaves are eaten both raw and boiled, and the dried stems are smoked in lieu of TOB, tobacco. This is an interesting sidebar to this because as a result of the Gorman work that I was doing, we also had a Fisher, W.J. Fisher field book that the field book project decided to go ahead and begin to digitize. They had cataloged it already. And this was the subject also of a blog by our senior cataloger on the project, Sonoy Nakasone, who, by the way, is related to Phyllis Nakasone of your library system here. Phyllis is her mother, and I just found that out. And we just met. And I've lost Sonoy since then. She's gone on to bigger and better things. But she wrote this story about William J. Fisher. And you know how blogs work. You can comment on them at the end, and people do that. Well, one of the comments was from the son of a Kenai elder in southern Alaska, who said, "My mother remembers Fisher." And some of the information you have about some of the entries, they would view differently. And they can offer additional information about plants that you have that maybe you don't have data for. Aaron Crowell in Anchorage and I have now started to work on plans and get grants to bring these elders to Washington to go through our collections and comment on them so that we can transcribe that and do a sort of a version of oral history as they go through these collections to impart what they know that would otherwise be mainly oral type history to the specimens and to the entries in Fisher's field books. And it will also relate to the entries in Gorman's field books where the taxa are the same. And this is the Recovering Voices website. We have a new project, a couple years old, and that they were sort of part of this whole conversation about bringing the language issues to light. So the common names that will be associated with these plants that we have, that the folks in Alaska will be commenting on, will also be drawn into the Recovering Voices program. Now, Sean also mentioned that I had two different Earthwatch projects. My first was an interesting program that Earthwatch administered, funding from a foundation that recruited teacher-nominated high school students from around the country to participate in science projects, primarily throughout North America, and they would select the students that they want, and the criteria was slightly unknown to me, but these are sharp kids, and basically give you your team for 2 weeks to work on your project. And this project was we had collected about 22,000 records of plants that had been collected over a century in the San Jacinto Mountains in Southern California, in central Riverside County. That created a baseline for what had occurred over that century, and we could begin to map the changes in plant species cover, the entire plant species composition over that period of time. And what we determined was that between the first 40 years, with a break in the middle, and the last 40 years, we documented a 30% change in the total plant species composition, which is a huge change if you take into account the losses, the apparent losses, because we don't know if they just weren't collected anymore, between the early part and the latter part, and the what appeared to be new records in the latter part, which not coincidentally tended to all be non-native species. So the combination of those two things was a pretty significant change. Now the plan was to go in and look for the gaps, collect more material, in which case, possibly new species to that list. And these kids were very instrumental in helping with that. As we got 2 years into this, it was going very well. And the Earthwatch Institute model, they recruit individuals will actually pay them to join you and do your work. It's kind of a cool thing going here. But there are people who would rather go on vacation with you than, I don't know, go to Waikiki or something like that. So they wanted me to come up with a project that would employ these adult teams. And instead of going into the field, we decided to go into the museum. And we created a project in the National Herbarium, in the Department of Botany, that essentially brought in teams over a period of 4 years, over 110 people during that time, who actually went through the collections, pulling out specimens. This is another cherry-picking operation, pulling out specimens from our Pacific Island collections. If it had data on it that defined this intersection between plants and people. That's all I wanted. Not everything, just the labels that said something about language, that said something about usage, that said something about preparation, listed an informant's name, whatever. And we ended up with over 11,000 records. Most of them are imaged, but all of them are completely database. And the information that defines that intersection is collected as well. What's happening today is a lot of digitization is going on, a lot of data collection is going on. They're imaging the specimens, they're putting them out there, and people are typing in the information, but they're collecting Spartan records. What, where, when, maybe something else. And the vast majority of information associated with even habitat, but definitely anything related to ethnology, it takes too long to get that in. We're in a hurry. We're looking for those 3 dimensions of biodiversity, and let's get it done. So this kind of information is not being religiously picked up. So we did that very carefully, and Michael and I have plans to use this information for a number of different projects. This is the public participation type of thing called citizen science. But what it produced, that's not what I wanted to do. What it produced was a really solid compendium of information that we had in the National Collection, and it spawned 2 spin-off projects that the next slide will begin. The University of Alberta and the Smithsonian have a collaborative project in which the province of Alberta sends 3 students every year to work at the Smithsonian, and we basically compete for them with project descriptions. And Katie is one of 2 that I've gotten over the years. Now, we had a conversation last night regarding stalking on Facebook, and that it's apparently it's not okay. But the way I see it, if they're going to come and spend the summer with me, I want to know who they are. And in most cases, there's no better way to learn about somebody than what they put up on Facebook. So I checked out Katie's Facebook page, and the minute it popped up, I wanted her. She had created as her profile picture a South Park character that looks amazingly like her. And so I brought her in. She ended up working on a project. I like your reference. She started working on a project to take all of our Fijian data and compare it to the 5-volume Flora Vidiensis that A.C. Smith produced, which was pretty recent, in which all of the entries have, if he had the data, information about uses, information about plant names. And she was comparing what we had to what was in there, and we determined that there was more than 15% of the species that we had collected data for didn't have all of that information in A.C. Smith's volumes. That is, it was either lacking some of the language data, or lacking some of the uses data, or lacking anything, and we had something. So at the very bottom here, you can see his entry, well, you may not, local names and uses, and it carries over to the next page, and he's talking about common names, and he's talking about uses here. In this example of Polyalthea, the top entry there for its angustifolia, that begins on the previous page, it only lists a local name, and that's only the record for a particular one single collection. And we had more information about that. So that was one of the spin-offs, the products of having taken the time to go through the collection and pull this together. And another example here, this is Centella, is actually Pennywort, and they had some local name information down here too. There was some additional usage information involving wedding lays and things like that wasn't recorded here. The other spin-off to this was a young fellow from the University of Maryland, Aaron Freeman, who is a crazy good writer, an amazing researcher, and in such a very short time, he did worked on the Tongan plant names that we had collected, over 500 specimens, and wrote a paper that I still pore through trying to figure out what he's talking about, but not being a linguist. He has moved on to Middle Eastern languages, and I'm trying to drag him back to finish this off because it hasn't been published. Over 500 specimens that we had collected between 26 and 71. The three primary collectors were Junker, Smith, and Whistler. Everybody here knows Art Whistler. The three primary references that he used were Whistler's Ethnobiology of Tonga, Junker's Plants of, and Churchward's Tongan Dictionary. And first he put together a list of all the primary taxa at a high level and all the pollination names that he could find that related to those generic level names. And then he took all of the name data that we had on our specimens and organized it on the left side with the taxon data, the particular language that it was supposed to represent. And then Churchward's definition of that word and any variant spellings that might exist. And in the end, between comparing it with Junker and comparing it with Whistler, there were 10 examples of names in the left-hand column that didn't occur anywhere. And what he did was, in each case, analyze that for why that might be the case. In the first, it turned out to be a very unique reference that didn't exist anywhere. It wasn't a variant of anything. It was just a slam dunk new name. In other cases, he determined that it may be derived from another name and just not so much a variant in the spelling, but as languages change over time, and these were cases where he saw that as being a derivation. The variations in spelling that he would assume, because you just don't always know. And the last two, these were what he called a deduction. In reading through it, the northwestern islands that are actually closer to Samoa have a slight difference in language and dialect than the traditional Tongan languages. And so in these cases, it looked like it was a variant, but the reality was one of the names was on a Tongan specimen in the main archipelago, and the other was from one of these outlying islands whose language was more akin to the other, and so he deduced that in fact these were two different names from two different dialects. It's a great paper. I'm trying to get him to finish it and start working with our Recovering Voices people to begin to incorporate these kinds of data into their work. his conclusions you can read. It was pretty impressive. It's a long paper. Basically what he's saying here is that there's a lot you can learn from taking the kind of information off of plant specimens. But it's not just the plant specimens. This kind of data exists also in the journals, in the archives, in all of the unpublished content. And pulling that together, this was a fairly limited data set. If we did this for all the Tomlin collections in different herbaria around the country, and definitely the one that we have here, I think that would be a more complete view of what that kind of data can contribute to our knowledge of language. So, to finish off, one of the things as I was roaming around the internet, looking for some information that I wanted to attach to some of these stories, I ran into this site, Emerging Ethnobiologists, and it seemed to kind of bring everything full circle, because one of the things I've been impressed with is the body of individuals that comprise the Ethnobiology Society. A lot of them are younger people, a lot of them are students, not all. But there is within all the old cadres I was showing you in the front slides we're going to all retire soon. But the emerging ethnobiologists are the ones that are going to be coming up, backfilling, and there are a lot of good ones. So I just wanted to throw this up here to give a little props to the people who are actually going into this scholarly work now. Oops, wrong direction. I wanted to finish with a quote from Maria Fadiman, who's an ethnobotanist at Florida Atlantic University, and again one of the bright lights of ethnobotany now in this country. And it kind of spoke to the difference between going into the field to do the romantic data collection and working behind the scenes in libraries and archives to do the very same thing. She said, I used to think that going into the jungle made my life an adventure. However, after years of unusual work in exotic places, I realized it's not how far off I go or how deep into the forest I walk that gives my life meaning. I see that living life fully is what makes life, anyone's life, no matter where they go or do not go, an adventure. If you've ever been to Starbucks, this was number 233 on the way I see it that they used to put on Starbucks cups. But it was just too good not to include. And at that, I'll leave it with a long list of acknowledgments, not the least of which is the bottom, the scores of students and hundreds of volunteers that have helped me in all of these different projects.